So you know how you have reading plans and you're supposed to be reading like continuations of a series, but then sometimes you see a book that you've never heard of that looks kind of awesome, and instead of reading what you're supposed to, you read something else? That's what I did, and I found this book called Midnight Water City. This is the hardest title I've read all year because I keep wanting to call it like Murder Midnight City or some weird combination, but the book is called Midnight Water City, and the cover looks like this. That's what really hooked me, mostly the fact that it was a sci-fi trilogy that was just starting with a cover like this, and then it looked like it was some kind of science fiction, detective, noir kind of deal that had to do with murder, and yeah, I was hooked, so I had to pick this up. What I found in Midnight Water City was one of the strangest reads that I've had all year, and I haven't fully come to grips with how I feel about it, so I'm just going to kind of share my thoughts as like a chaotic stream of consciousness here. One of the most interesting things about this book to me is that while it is a science fiction noir detective story, and noir stories sort of always have this like, and then it was midnight, and I had to find the murderer. This guy, the protagonist of this book in particular, is an 80-year-old man who's been like divorced 3 times. He's on his 4th wife. He's kind of a washed up failure in a lot of ways, which is typical for this genre. But the 80-year-old man part is really interesting. It's this curmudgeonly, grumpy old dude. And I feel like with the books that I've read recently and in general, most protagonists just aren't octogenarians. The character's age is very important because he's seen a lot of things through history. He's experienced a lot of important parts of history. He's known a lot of important people throughout his life. And the things that he's struggling with, he has a lot of physical ailments that he has to deal with. And then there's this sort of subtext under the entire story, which is, hey, this is an 80-year-old dude who has been through all of these experiences. He spends a lot of time being confused, which does translate to the reader. This book was such a strange experience for me because whether on purpose or not, and in reality I think it's probably a blend of the two, there are a lot of confusing things that happen in the story, potential logic gaps, maybe like errant connections as like pieces of the puzzle are being discovered and placed together, that multiple times while reading this book, I would have a revelation moment and be confused if it was something I was supposed to understand or something I was supposed to be able to figure out myself, even when they were explaining the details. Like there were lots of times when I was just kind of in the dark and I felt like I'd missed something, but I actually, in hindsight, after completing the book, think some of that was intentional. There's supposed to be a lot of confusion here. I think the protagonist, because of lots of various factors, is very confused here. And so what you're presented with is a story that you understand bits and pieces of at the beginning, and then as you learn more about the world, you will have to recontextualize many of the pieces of the story that you've heard before, which does mean that you retread a lot of familiar ground. You're going to be covering a lot of the same events and characters and even important moments multiple times, and every time you encounter those moments in this book, you're going to have to reframe what you think about actually happened there in the same way that the character's journey causes him to like question things. And it's very unique in that way. I don't know if that's going to work for everyone. Frankly, I don't know if it works for me. I think it's an interesting choice. I think it's a unique way of trying to tell a story, but I don't know if it landed all the way for me. Another thing that I have to say about the story is that it almost feels like in the act of having the protagonist of the story be an 80-year-old man who does a lot of internal reflection, which is part of the genre. It's also part of the, 80-year-old man shtick. It seems like maybe the author used this narrative option as a way to try to fit in the fact that the character will just go on exposition dumps, whether he's talking to someone or whether it's in his own internal monologue, because there are so many times when you will break from your moment-to-moment story, sometimes in the middle of more like intense action, for this dude to go on some kind of long multi-paragraph like, it was like this back in the day, or I remember this character from this part of my life, and then he'll just go off. Sometimes it's about history, sometimes it's about culture, sometimes it's about a personal event, but there is a lot of just like breaking from current scene to old man yells at cloud. While those interruptions to the story do feel like they could fit in world based on the nature of the protagonist, it can sometimes be jarring, it can sometimes be a little bit obnoxious, and because a lot of times you're treading the same or very similar ground, it can be confusing. Like, didn't I already hear this? Or is he just reframing these events in his mind? Or is this guy crazy? Like, there's so many confusing elements when you're going through the story, which is normally something that I like. I like to be in the dark for a lot of a story. But the reframing and retreading of so many different things didn't always work for me. That being said, and those negatives aside, the world that is established here and some of the interesting future speculations that are done here based on like the science fiction elements of this is what happens in the world because of these problems that we never fixed. This is what happened in the world based on these problems that we did fix. Some of that stuff is really awesome. The actual primary central plot of the story, I think, is a really interesting tale to follow. It really just boils down to the execution and delivery method being a little bit strange for me personally. While this world is really interesting in some ways, I am genuinely confused about where the next story in this trilogy will take place because the book is very self-conclusive. I think like it very much could be a standalone, which is a plus. But also, if this is going to be a trilogy, I have no idea where it goes from here. I didn't feel like there was a ton of hooks that made me really want to get book 2 as soon as possible. In addition to the primary protagonist that we talked about, there are some side characters. Some of them are really interesting. One of them in particular I ended up liking a lot. But in all actuality, the way that characters are handled in this book is not traditional, and because of that, the side characters aren't necessarily super fleshed out, at least in a way that I would traditionally expect, in a way that would like lead me towards wanting to see more of their arcs in the future. Once again, I'm really struggling to talk about that aspect because of spoiler elements, but yeah, this book really was interesting. I liked the ending, but I'm not sure where it would go from here. And so this has been one of my like most conflicting reads of this year because there are elements that I think were unique and I've never seen them before. I love the bold direction and attempt at those elements. I just don't know if they actually landed for me. And while I'm glad I read the story, I don't think it's one that I can fully recommend unless you're okay with these caveats that I've mentioned. It definitely isn't going to be like one of my favorites of the year, but it also isn't a read that I hated. I never had any major significant problems with it. I'm curious if other people read this book because I do think that there is a certain demographic that really should read this book and might enjoy it a lot more than me. I'd be curious to hear what you thought about it, what you thought about the way the story was told and the way that like it sort of rehashed a lot of this stuff. The way that, like I said, like some of the main characters of the story were not traditionally presented. I'm curious if you got some of the really interesting vibes because at parts of this story, it feels less like a science fiction noir story and more like sometimes it's a little more horror. Sometimes it's a little more other genres that I won't sort of spoil, but it is a really interesting and bold take that I just don't know if it succeeds on every level that I wish it did. Is this a book that you've heard about before this review? Is this a book that sounds awesome to you? Let me know in the comments down below, please. If you like this video review, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more reviews from me in the future, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. If you'd like to discuss this book, another book, or anything else, there's a link to a Discord down below. If you'd like to support the channel financially, there's a link to a Patreon down below, no pressure. I hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, remember, the book is called Midnight, Water City. Thank you.
Sleep, no one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. If it don't show up, I might get fired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. Always looking out tired. Sleep, no one ever get enough. If I don't show up, I might get fired.